Hello. No, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. I can't agree more with everything that has just been said. It's brilliantly put, and I agree with it all. And the work of glitching this has been something that we at Hope Not Hate have looked at really, really closely over the last year or so on this, and it's amazing. So I'm from Hope Not Hate. My name's Joe Mulhall. We look specifically, or more specifically, at the far right and the online far right. Which obviously plays a role in this, but in some ways we look at the more organised players that are engaging in online harms, as well as some of the more broader issues that are being discussed. So I just wanted to touch on a few things and kind of highlight how the far right and the organised kind of hate distributors use social media and how that affects the online harms bill. I think there's a few things. The obvious ones are very clear. The far right use social media to attack their victims, to harass people. They use it to organise. They use it to propagandise. They use it to recruit. They use it to radicalize, they use it to fundraise, all of these things you'd expect. And one of the really important things, of course, is understanding the dynamics between online and offline. You know, a lot of the online harms, yes, we have to talk about online harms, but this stuff also plays out in our communities and on our streets. And many of the people that experience online harms will also experience these things in their workplaces, in their communities, and from direct people like the far right. And from the off, one of the things I just think is really important in this whole debate is how we frame the debate around online harms. I'm going to talk very briefly about how I think things like deplatforming are positive and how it's important that online harms regulates this sort of stuff. But we have to frame this as an expansion of free speech. Many of the communities that were just mentioned and the real centrality of taking an intersectional approach here, these voices are already marginalized on our social media and online more broadly, and they're shut down by people on the far right, by people that are oppressing these communities and attacking these communities. And dealing with online harm shouldn't be framed as just shutting away and getting rid of the people we don't want online. It needs to also be an understanding about how we expand the plurality of voices online so that we actually have more genuine free speech. And we have to be really careful, because if we get this wrong, this will be, the online harms discussion will be framed as shutting down freedom of speech. And it's not actually, it's about expanding it. So just a few very brief points. Yes, the far right uses social media in all the ways I just mentioned that you would expect, but I think it's important to understand that it's actually altered the nature of the way that online or the far right does its business, it does its activism. At Hope Not Hate, we talk regularly about this thing called a post-organisational far right. And while the hatred of the far right and the politics of the far right has been relatively consistent for a very long time, the internet and social media has changed the way they do business. The days, while of course we still have big far right organizations, we have kind of, you know, they're not what they were. The BNP is not what it's were. The National Front is not what it was. What we now have on top of those traditional organizations is this post-organizational world, which is thousands and thousands of far right individuals all over the world, offering micro donations of time, sometimes money, and they collaborate together online towards common political goals. Often completely outside of formalized organizations. And what we see here is they draw on a increasing selection of what you might call far-right social media influencers. For most of the post-war period, becoming far-right or getting involved meant signing up, going to a meeting, delivering newspapers, selling newspapers, etc. There was kind of traditional ways you did it. Now you can sit in your bedroom and you can send harassment to someone anywhere in the world. This is a globalized phenomenon. You can have people experiencing hate online in the UK that is being organized by far-right networks in North America, or Australia, or Asia, or anywhere in the world. We have to think beyond just our street and our community now. We have to go well beyond that. The far right online is now a many-headed hydra, if you will. And this makes it very, very difficult when it comes to how do we deal with this phenomenon. No longer can you just take away the leader of a movement and the movement collapses. Now we just have a replacement emerges. We have thousands of people. And also the way they use social media is like a series of synapses. They pass information between them. You know, if you think about anti-Muslim prejudice online, yes, people will be talking about halal chicken nuggets in a school in Stoke, but they will also be talking about halal chicken nuggets at a school in Warsaw or Berlin. And they crowdsource their anger and they crowdsource their information. And we have these super sharers that essentially are these nodes where this information passes through, these big far right figures. Understanding the global nature of this problem is going to be central to understanding how we get an online harms bill that is effective. There's not necessarily easy answers for these, but we need to consider them. So what are our options in terms of the online harms bill? Well, in one way, I think it's about disrupting these synapses, breaking these networks, and deplatforming is important to this. Part of this is a real simple one. Beyond the bill, it's just the social media companies need to enforce their existing policies. Many of them have great policies on paper. They just don't deal with it in the real world. But I do think, as many people, and I think there's probably a consensus forming, that the time of self-regulation of these tech companies is over, and time for legislation is now and important. And the question is why. Part of it is we've seen just in the last year, if I take two very brief examples, how this online behavior from the far right, this kind of hateful online behavior, has had real impact. One is the expansion and explosion of the conspiracy scene. As has just been mentioned about COVID, we've seen social media used by conspiracy mongers that have started in the niche corners of the far right internet in America and spread around the world. Things like QAnon, things like COVID conspiracies, anti-vax conspiracies have exploded on mainstream social media platforms, and once again shown us that social media companies are only acting in response to crises. They're only acting in response when there is major international or public pressure around something like the storming of the Capitol, when they then start another wave of deplatforming. We need to have a robust system of legislation that means that, as has been mentioned, that we build safeguards into our social media and into our digital systems to mean that we can deal with the problems before they arise, rather than relying on the tech companies to act in response to crises when there is international pressure. Another good example of this is the kind of migrant crisis discussions of the last year within the British far right about cross-channel migration. Here we saw how they use social media so effectively and how it affects public discourse. There was the creation of these kind of so-called far-right citizen journalists that stood at Dover every day, live streaming footage on YouTube, creating this anger and animation within the British far right, and it spread onto Facebook and Twitter, and then it spread through Telegram, and it built up. And then you see the next group up of the British far right, Britain First, For Britain, these more traditional organizations holding demonstrations. You see Nigel Farage then talking about it in right-wing media, and then we start to see some of the rhetoric from Priti Patel, which is pretty indistinguishable from some of the stuff we're seeing here. Here we're seeing how the far right ecosystem works. It creates energy, it crowdsources information, and it can in the long run affect mainstream narratives. So I think there's a few things at play. The final thing I want to mention in terms of the online harms bill is we have to understand, when we're creating legislation, how the online space works. Too much of the discussion is just solely talking about Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, the big major platforms. And of course, that is in many ways, understandably, where most people will experience abuse and harassment. And that's really, really important that we deal with those platforms. That's where most people are. However, there is a kind of slightly binary understanding that there is these mainstream platforms, and people leave those mainstream platforms when they're kicked off them and they go to, other platforms like Telegram or Gab. Actually, what we see at Hope Not Hate on a daily basis is there is a plurality of social media platforms, ranging from mainstream platforms like Facebook and Twitter, co-opted platforms which are not ostensibly far right but used by people on the far right like Telegram, etc. And then these bespoke platforms, which are often very small, but things like BitChute, the video sharing one, or Gab, which are created consciously to host news content by the far right, often created by the far right themselves. And many of the people that we would monitor at Hope Not Hate use all of these platforms simultaneously. And they use them for different purposes. They might use Facebook and Twitter to harass and target people, or to propagandize and fundraise. They might organize their planning on Telegram. They might get engaged in their really extreme behavior in closed groups on Signal. And understanding that it's not just this binary from big platform to small platform is going to be central to making the online harms bill effective. They use them simultaneously, and they use them for different purposes. And that's why one of the things that I think is kind of covered, but we need to make sure is really kind of buttressed in this, is the smaller platforms. Too often, and it's been mentioned about building in from the very beginning safeguards in these platforms. We have to understand that not all tech platforms have a problem they don't want. Some of the tech platforms we monitor are consciously created with a view to propagating and pushing hatred. And so how we talk about tech platforms often is from a perspective of how do we deal with the fact that some platforms have a hatred problem that they don't want. We also need to add into the conversation platforms that are designed for exactly that purpose, and have a conversation about how we deal with that with online regulation. And then finally is legal but harmful, as has been mentioned. Much of the behavior that we see from the far right doesn't cross the threshold of legality, becoming illegal. And often it might be, for example, especially harassment campaigns, is 1,000 people sending one message, none of which those messages might break the law, but collectively is clearly harassment. And that can have huge detrimental effects on the people experiencing that sort of online behaviour. So making sure that as we go forward, and let's hope this bill comes soon, we've all been waiting for it for far too long, as it kind of comes into play, we need to make sure that it continues to be broad. Its broadness is one of its positive elements to this, and we make sure that we are robust enough and strong enough to fight for it continuing to stray broad, carrying on beyond just the legal and concluding the legal but harmful, and making sure then that we have a bill that actually deals with some of these problems and we don't let it get chipped away. And central to that is going to be this thing about making sure we frame this in a way that is about expanding free speech, expanding and allowing voices, a plurality of voices, especially from affected minorities and communities and these people that experience intersecting identities, their voices. We create an online space which is more positive, where more voices are heard, not just by shutting down the hateful ones. Cheers.